Hey guys, for something as ordinary as a toothache, medieval life could become far stranger, slower, and more miserable than most people now imagine. Bad teeth were not simply the result of people being careless, or of some cartoon version of the past where everyone ignored basic hygiene. They were tied to food, to work, to status, to age, to medicine, and to the quiet material limits of everyday life in a world where pain was common and relief was uncertain. Before we settle in, let me know where you're watching from and which piece of history you'd like us to explore next. And if you enjoy this kind of thoughtful long-form history, a like is a simple way to support the channel. And if calm, quietly fascinating history is something you'd like more of, you're very welcome to subscribe. To understand why medieval teeth went bad so easily, it helps to begin with a small correction to a modern assumption. People in medieval Europe were not living in a permanent cloud of sugar in the way many modern societies do. They did not have shelves of sweets, fizzy drinks, sticky packaged snacks, or the constant low-level exposure to refined sugar that now damages teeth so effectively over time. So at first glance, it might seem as though medieval people should actually have had better teeth than many people do now. And in some cases, in certain places, among certain groups, they probably did. But that is only part of the story, because teeth do not decay for just one reason. They wear down, they crack, gums recede, infection spreads, the jaw changes with age, diet shifts with class and region, bread carries traces of grit, illness weakens the body, deficiencies leave their mark. A damaged tooth, once broken or infected, could remain in the mouth for months or years. And perhaps most importantly of all, medieval people lived in a world where avoiding pain was far more difficult than enduring it. So the real question is not simply why medieval teeth were bad. It is why bad teeth were so easy to acquire, so hard to treat, and so deeply woven into ordinary life. For many people, the trouble began with food that looked harmless. Bread, for example, was the center of life across much of medieval Europe. It was daily food, expected food, necessary food. But bread was not always soft, light, or clean by modern standards. Grain had to be ground, usually with millstones, and that grinding process often introduced fine stone particles into the flour. Over time, those tiny fragments could act like a slow abrasive. This did not necessarily rot the teeth in the same way sugar does, but it could wear them down. Enamel, once damaged, does not quietly repair itself. The chewing surfaces of the teeth might flatten, thin, or crack. Small problems could become openings for larger ones. And medieval bread was not a single thing. Wealthier households might enjoy finer white bread made from sifted wheat flour, while poorer people often depended on darker, rougher loaves made from rye, barley, oats, maslin, or whatever mixture the land and season allowed. In years of hardship, bread might be stretched with peas, beans, chestnut flour, or less appealing fillers. Some of these foods were nourishing. Some were simply necessary. But necessity did not always treat the mouth kindly. Then there was the question of texture. Medieval diets often required more chewing than modern processed diets. Meat could be salted, fibrous, or tough. Pottage might be soft, but crusts, dried foods, and coarse grains were not always gentle. A mouth worked constantly and over a lifetime that mattered. Teeth were tools as much as body parts. They were used not only to eat but sometimes to grip, tear, or hold things during work. That practical use sounds minor until one imagines decades of it. Even so, wear alone does not explain the deeper misery. Wear might flatten teeth, but infection turned them into a source of real suffering. And once infection arrived, the medieval person entered a world of limited options. Dental pain in the Middle Ages was not interpreted exactly as it would be now. There were practical observations, of course. People knew a rotten tooth from a sound one. They knew swelling, foul smell, looseness, bleeding gums, and the sharp difference between a dull ache and a stabbing pain. But explanation often mixed practical knowledge with older medical theories. Much of learned medicine in medieval Europe was shaped by inherited classical traditions, especially humoral thinking. The body was understood as a system of balance and imbalance. Pain might be explained through corrupted humors, trapped matter, cold, heat, dampness, or other internal disturbances. That does not mean medieval healers knew nothing. It means they placed what they saw inside a different map of the body. And in ordinary life, people often responded first not with a trained specialist, but with household remedies, local knowledge, herbal applications, rinses, poultices, or prayer. A sore mouth might be washed with wine, vinegar, salt water, or plant-based mixtures. Clove, when available, had real numbing qualities, though access varied. Other treatments were less effective, and some were likely useless. The medieval world, like every world, contained a mixture of wisdom, guesswork, habit, and hope. That mixture is one reason the subject becomes more human the longer one looks at it. A tooth did not go from healthy to gone in a single dramatic moment. Could begin as sensitivity, then chewing became cautious, then one side of the mouth was favored over the other, then sleep became difficult, then swelling appeared, then a smell, then perhaps fever. By that point, the problem was no longer really about the tooth. It was about the whole body, and about how long a person could keep working while carrying pain that would not leave. This is where modern viewers often misunderstand the medieval experience. It is tempting to imagine people as simply more used to pain, as though that solved the problem. They were certainly more familiar with discomfort than most people in wealthy societies are today. They had no expectation of a painless life, but familiarity is not relief. A person may endure pain because there is no alternative, and still be diminished by it every day. A peasant with an infected molar still had to fetch water, carry wood, tend animals, weed fields, knead dough, and survive weather. A craftsman still had to keep his hands steady. A woman responsible for household labor still had children to manage, meals to prepare, and countless small tasks with no pause built into them. Pain did not excuse work. It merely accompanied it. And then there were the gums, which rarely received the same attention in popular imagination. Tooth decay is easy to picture. Gum disease is quieter, slower, and in some ways more revealing. Poor oral hygiene, nutritional deficiencies, chronic illness, and general wear could all contribute to inflamed or receding gums. Once gums became unhealthy, teeth loosened. A mouth could deteriorate not because each tooth rotted dramatically, but because the entire supporting structure slowly failed. In an age without modern dentistry, even a tooth that was not deeply decayed could eventually be lost. Status complicated this picture in unexpected ways. One might assume wealth always protected the medieval mouth, but the story is not so simple. Wealthier people often had access to softer bread, richer foods, sweetened dishes, imported delicacies, and more frequent feasting. Honey had long been used as a sweetener, and later in the medieval period, as trade expanded and sugar became more available among elites, certain diets could become more harmful to dental health. Sugar was not yet an everyday item for most people, but among the wealthy it could appear as medicine, luxury, ingredient, and status symbol. The irony is quiet but important. Privilege sometimes brought with it the very foods that increased certain dental risks. At the same time, elites might have somewhat better access to learned practitioners, to more varied remedies, and to the possibility of extraction by someone with experience. Not comfort exactly, not safety as we would define it, but options. For poorer people, the options narrowed quickly. A loose or rotten tooth might simply remain until it either fell out or became unbearable. Extraction existed, But it was not a simple visit to a clean clinic under controlled conditions. Teeth could be pulled by barber surgeons, itinerant practitioners, or others with practical skill, but the experience would have been frightening for good reason. Pain relief was limited. Infection was a danger. Instruments were basic. And yet, when agony became severe enough, extraction could still seem like mercy. There is a calm but important reversal here. The Middle Ages are often imagined as an age of dirt and ignorance, as though bad teeth were only the result of neglect. But in many cases, the deeper problem was not indifference. It was limitation. Even a person who cared about their mouth, who rinsed it, cleaned it, rubbed the teeth with cloth or powders, used a twig or toothpick, and avoided obvious harm could still lose teeth to wear, infection, poor nutrition, fever, accident, or age. Medieval people were not uniquely foolish. They were simply living without the safety net that turns a small dental problem into a routine inconvenience rather than a life-disturbing ordeal. Some did try to clean their teeth. This is another place where the caricature needs soft correction. Tooth cleaning practices existed in various forms. People used cloths, powders, herbs, and sticks. Learned texts sometimes recommended substances to clean, whiten, or strengthen the teeth. Some treatments were sensible enough. Others were abrasive, cosmetic, or misguided. But the desire for a cleaner mouth, fresher breath, and better appearance was not absent. It simply operated inside a different technical world. And appearance mattered. Teeth were not only functional. The mouth was part of social presence. Foul breath could be noticed. Missing teeth could alter speech, chewing, and expression. In some contexts, especially among the upper classes, appearance was tied to dignity and courtly identity. Yet even there, vanity met the hard wall of practical medicine. One could care how one looked and still have very little power to stop decline once it had begun. Age, of course, shaped everything. Childhood illnesses could affect development. Malnutrition could leave its trace long before adulthood. By middle age, years of wear had accumulated. By old age, for those who reached it, the mouth often told the story of the entire life that had passed through it. A modern person might imagine old age with dentures, fillings, root canals, and decades of intervention already behind them. Medieval old age often meant the opposite. Fewer intact teeth, more difficulty chewing, narrower choices of food, and the quiet humiliation of bodily decline accepted because it had to be. That last part is easy to miss from a distance. When teeth go bad, eating changes. And when eating changes, life changes with it. Hard foods become difficult. Meat becomes troublesome. Crusts are avoided. Texture begins to rule appetite. For someone already close to the edge of adequate nutrition, that matters. The damaged mouth can begin to shape the whole body. The person eats less or eats less well, and weakness deepens the original problem. There is also the matter of season. Medieval health was rarely stable across the entire year. Winter narrowed diets. Fresh produce disappeared. Preservation kept people alive, but not always comfortably. If the gums worsened after months of monotonous food, if general weakness increased susceptibility to infection, if cold made pain feel sharper and travel for treatment less likely, then the mouth became one more place where the season could be felt. A toothache in summer was misery enough. A toothache in deep winter, in a cold house with poor sleep and a coarse diet, belonged to a much larger pattern of hardship. And still, people adapted. They chewed differently. They favored one side. They softened bread in broth or ale. They learned which herbs soothed a little. They delayed treatment until delay was no longer possible. They lived around pain in the same way they lived around smoke, mud, dampness, hunger, and darkness. Not because these things were small, but because daily life offered no clean escape from them. If you ever find yourself settling into one of these stories and imagining medieval bad teeth as just another grim detail, it is worth pausing for a moment on how personal the experience must have been. Tooth pain is peculiarly difficult to ignore. It enters sleep, changes mood, it narrows patience. It makes the whole head feel occupied. In a crowded house, with work at dawn and little privacy, there was nowhere to step aside from it for long. And because the pain was hidden, in the sense that others could not always see its full force, it may often have gone half-recognized by the people around the sufferer. The work still needed doing. The day still moved on. That is one reason the subject opens into something larger than dentistry. A medieval tooth is really a small doorway into diet, labor, class, medicine, trade, aging, and endurance. It tells us how people ate, what they could afford, what they believed about the body, and how limited the line was between discomfort and crisis. It also tells us something a little humbling about historical progress. Not all suffering in the past came from dramatic war or plague or execution. Some of it came from an ordinary mouth in an ordinary face, carrying pain through an ordinary day. And once we begin to follow that ordinary pain a little further, it leads us into a still deeper question. Not just how medieval people's teeth failed, but what happened when the mouth became a site of status, smell, intimacy, and judgment inside a world where almost every other part of the body was being judged as well. Because in medieval society, the mouth was not private. It was part of how a person was read by others, sometimes quietly, sometimes quite directly. Breath, for instance, carried meaning. In a world without modern deodorants, where bodies were often close together in enclosed spaces, scent was a constant part of social life. The smell of the mouth could signal illness, decay, diet, or simply neglect, though neglect itself was rarely a simple choice. It might reflect poverty, limited access to resources, or the slow erosion of the body through years of labor. Texts from the period, especially those concerned with manners, courtly behavior, or health, occasionally hint at an awareness of this. There were recommendations, sometimes practical, sometimes idealized, about keeping the mouth clean, about avoiding offensive breath, about presenting oneself in a way that did not disturb others. These were not universal expectations, and they were not always achievable. But they suggest that people noticed. They noticed the difference between a healthy mouth and an unhealthy one, even if they could not always explain or treat it effectively. And this is where the experience becomes more layered. Because the mouth, unlike many other parts of the body, is directly involved in communication. Teeth shape speech. Missing teeth alter sounds, soften consonants, or make certain words harder to form. For someone whose work or social position required speaking, whether in trade, in household authority, or in any kind of negotiation, a damaged mouth could quietly affect how they were understood. That does not mean medieval society functioned like a modern workplace where clarity of speech is often tied to opportunity. But it does mean that the condition of the mouth could subtly influence social interactions. A person who spoke less clearly might be perceived differently. A person who avoided speaking because of pain might withdraw slightly from conversation. These are small shifts, but over time they shape relationships. There is also the question of intimacy, which medieval sources tend to approach indirectly. The mouth is close to others in moments of conversation, eating, shared living, and private life. In households where space was limited, where multiple people slept in the same room, where daily life unfolded in close proximity, the presence of persistent dental decay or infection was not easily hidden. It became part of how others experienced a person's presence. And yet, here again, there is a quiet reversal of expectation. Modern viewers might assume that such issues would lead to strong social stigma, but the reality was likely more complex. When many people share similar conditions, when bad teeth, missing teeth, or gum disease are common, the standard for judgment shifts. What might be striking in a modern context could be unremarkable in a medieval one. The threshold for what counted as unusual was simply different. Still, differences existed. The elite, who had access to more refined diets, more controlled environments, and sometimes more deliberate grooming practices, could present a slightly different standard of appearance. Not a perfect one, but a different one. And within courtly settings, where manners and presentation were more explicitly shaped, the mouth could become part of a broader effort to signal refinement. Cleanliness, breath, and appearance were not trivial concerns there. They were part of identity. This creates a subtle tension between image and reality. A noble household might cultivate the appearance of order, elegance, and controlled living, yet behind that image, the same biological processes were at work. Teeth still wore down, gums still weakened, pain still arrived without warning. The difference was not the absence of dental problems, but the way those problems were managed, concealed, or interpreted. Meanwhile, outside elite circles, the rhythms of work and survival left less space for such concerns. The mouth was functional first. It needed to endure food, labor, and time. Its appearance, while not irrelevant, was secondary to its usefulness. And even that usefulness could not always be preserved. It is also worth noticing how little separation there was between dental health and general health. Today, it is common to think of the mouth as a distinct area of care, something that can be maintained with its own routines and professionals. In the medieval world, the boundaries were less clear. A problem in the mouth could spread to the rest of the body. Infection could travel. Fever could follow. Weakness could deepen. The mouth was not isolated. It was part of a system that, once disturbed, could affect everything else. And this brings us to the people who attempted to intervene more directly, the practitioners who occupied the uneasy space between daily remedies and learned medicine. Among them were barber surgeons, figures who combined practical skill with a role that, by modern standards, seems unusual. They cut hair, performed minor surgical procedures, treated wounds, and, when necessary, extracted teeth. The act of extraction itself was both simple and profound. Simple in the sense that the goal was clear: remove the source of pain. Profound because it involved immediate, intense experience. Without modern anesthesia, without sterile environments, without the reassurance of predictable outcomes, the moment of extraction would have been something people approached with a mixture of fear and necessity. The tools were basic but not entirely crude. Forceps-like instruments existed, along with other devices designed to grip and pull. Skill mattered. A practitioner who knew how to position the instrument, how to apply pressure, how to avoid breaking the tooth and leaving fragments behind, could make the difference between relief and further suffering. But even in the best case, the process was not gentle. What followed was equally uncertain. The wound might heal cleanly, or it might become infected. The body might recover quickly, or it might struggle. In a world without antibiotics, without controlled sanitation, the line between a successful extraction and a dangerous complication was not always clear in advance. And yet, people chose it. They chose it because the alternative, enduring a tooth that had become a source of constant, escalating pain, could be worse. This is one of those moments where the medieval experience becomes sharply relatable. Even now, people understand the desire to remove a source of pain when it becomes overwhelming. The difference lies in what followed, in the absence of the safety structures that modern medicine quietly provides. Alongside extraction, there were also attempts to treat teeth in less final ways. Some texts describe procedures intended to clean cavities, to apply substances to affected areas, or to manage gum disease. The effectiveness of these treatments varied widely. Some may have offered temporary relief. Others likely did little. But their existence again points to a world that was not passive. People did not simply accept dental problems without response. They experimented, adapted, and sought help within the limits available to them. There is a quiet persistence in that, a willingness to keep trying, even when success was uncertain. If we follow that persistence a little further, it leads into the environments where people lived with these problems day after day. The medieval home was not a place of isolation from bodily discomfort. It was where discomfort was carried, shared, and sometimes normalized. Meals were eaten together. Work was done together. Illness unfolded in the presence of others. A person with a severe toothache did not retreat to a private room with controlled lighting and medication. They remained within the flow of household life. This shared environment shaped how pain was experienced. It could be witnessed, supported, or quietly endured alongside others dealing with their own forms of discomfort. The community, whether family or household, became part of the response. Advice might be offered, remedies suggested, sympathy given, but there were limits to what anyone could do. And beyond the home, there were larger forces that influenced dental health in ways that were not immediately visible. Trade, for example, slowly altered diets. As connections expanded, new foods and ingredients entered certain regions. Some of these changes were gradual, almost unnoticeable in a single lifetime. But over generations, they shifted patterns of consumption. Sugar, in particular, begins to appear more frequently in later medieval and early post-medieval contexts among the wealthy. At first, it is rare, expensive, almost medicinal in its framing. It is used in small quantities, valued for its taste and its perceived health properties. But its presence marks the beginning of a change. A slow introduction of a substance that, over time, would have profound effects on dental health, especially as access widened. At this stage, though, its impact is uneven. Most people still live far from regular sugar consumption, but the seeds of a different kind of dental problem are being planted quietly, within specific social layers, within specific regions, tied to trade routes and economic shifts that most individuals never see directly. This is another example of how the mouth reflects larger systems. What a person eats is not only a matter of choice. It is shaped by land, by climate, by labor, by trade, by status, and by time. Teeth record those influences in a way that is both intimate and historical. And if we step slightly forward in that direction, toward the slow transformation of diet, toward the increasing complexity of trade, toward the subtle ways in which new substances begin to alter old patterns, we begin to see the early outlines of a change that will not be fully felt for some time, but is already beginning to move beneath the surface. Because what is quietly forming here is not just a shift in what people eat, but a shift in how damage accumulates. Earlier in the medieval period, much of the harm done to teeth came from wear, from grit, from long use, from the slow breakdown of the mouth under pressure and age. But as new foods begin to circulate, especially more refined carbohydrates and, eventually, greater access to sugar among certain groups, the pattern starts to change. The damage becomes less about abrasion alone and more about decay that begins invisibly, beneath the surface, in ways that are harder to anticipate. At first, this difference would not have been obvious to the people living through it. A tooth that hurt was still simply a tooth that hurt. The distinction between mechanical wear and chemical decay was not framed in modern terms. But over time, the experience itself would have begun to feel different. Cavities might deepen more quickly. Teeth that looked intact could suddenly become painful. The timing of deterioration shifted in ways that did not always match older expectations. This is where the story becomes more subtle, because the medieval world was not static. It was changing slowly, unevenly, sometimes imperceptibly within a single lifetime. And the mouth, again, becomes a kind of record of those changes, even when the people experiencing them could not fully articulate what was happening. In towns and growing urban centers, these shifts could be felt more sharply. Urban life brought different kinds of food, different patterns of work, and different exposures. Markets offered variety, but also inconsistency. Bread might still be central, but it came from many bakers, many sources with varying quality. Prepared foods circulated more widely. Preservation techniques varied. Hygiene conditions were different from those in rural settings, often more crowded, more complex, and sometimes less predictable. And with density came something else: the increased visibility of illness. In a village, patterns of health might feel familiar, almost expected. In a town, differences stood out more. A person with severe dental decay might be one among many, but the variation in conditions between wealthy and poor, between skilled and unskilled, between those with access to resources and those without, became more visible. This visibility mattered because it shaped perception. It influenced what people noticed, what they talked about, what they feared. A badly infected mouth, swelling the face, distorting speech, producing a persistent smell, was not just a private discomfort. It was something others encountered, something that could evoke concern, avoidance, or quiet judgment, depending on the context. At the same time, urban environments also brought a slightly greater chance of encountering practitioners with more specialized experience. Not always formally trained in a modern sense, but often more practiced simply because they saw more cases. A barber surgeon in a busy town might extract teeth regularly, developing a kind of practical familiarity that someone in a rural setting might never acquire. This did not make the experience safe or predictable, but it did create pockets of skill within the broader uncertainty. And people learned where those pockets were. They learned who could be trusted, who had steady hands, who had helped others before. Reputation mattered, sometimes more than any formal system of training. But even here, there is a quiet tension between knowledge and limitation. Because while experience could improve technique, it did not change the underlying constraints. There was still no reliable way to prevent infection after an extraction. There was still no way to restore a damaged tooth to full function. There was still no method to halt decay once it had advanced beyond a certain point. Skill could manage the moment, could not transform the system, and so much of medieval dental life remained reactive. Problems were addressed when they became unbearable. Pain was endured until it could not be ignored. Interventions were decisive but often final, removal rather than repair. This has an interesting effect on how we understand medieval attitudes toward the body. There is sometimes an assumption that people were less attentive to bodily maintenance, but in many cases the opposite is true. They were attentive, but they were working within a framework that did not allow for continuous preventative care in the modern sense. There was no routine dental checkup, no early intervention that could quietly correct a problem before it became serious. Attention did not always translate into control. There were also beliefs that shaped how people responded to dental problems in ways that feel unfamiliar now. One of the most persistent ideas in medieval and early modern Europe was the notion of the toothworm, a small creature believed to inhabit the tooth and cause pain. This idea appears in various forms across different cultures and periods. It may sound strange, but it reflects an attempt to explain a real experience, the sudden, localized, often intense pain that seemed to come from within the tooth itself. Treatments inspired by this belief could involve attempts to draw out or kill the worm using smoke, heat, or certain substances. From a modern perspective, these methods do not align with the actual causes of decay. But from the perspective of someone trying to make sense of their own body with limited tools, the idea was not entirely irrational. It was a way of giving shape to something invisible. And that is a recurring theme here, the gap between experience and explanation. Medieval people experienced dental pain in ways that were immediate and undeniable. But the underlying processes, bacterial activity, chemical breakdown, microscopic changes, remained unseen. So explanations filled that space, sometimes accurately, sometimes not, but always grounded in the effort to understand. It is also worth noticing how often the response to dental problems involved the entire body, not just the mouth. Treatments might include changes in diet, purging, bloodletting, or other methods aimed at restoring balance to the body as a whole. Again, this reflects the medical framework of the time. The tooth was not isolated. It was part of a larger system that needed to be brought back into harmony. From a modern standpoint, this can seem misguided, but it also reveals something important about how people conceptualized health. They were not ignoring the mouth. They were integrating it into a broader understanding of the body. The problem was not the absence of thought. It was the limitation of available knowledge and tools. If we return for a moment to the daily experience, we can begin to see how all of these factors came together in ways that were both ordinary and deeply significant. A person might wake with a dull ache that had been present for days. They might eat cautiously, favoring one side. They might rinse their mouth with whatever remedy was available. They might continue working because work could not wait. The pain might subside slightly, then return more sharply. Swelling might begin. Sleep might become more difficult. At some point, a decision would have to be made, whether to seek help, to endure, or to attempt some form of self-treatment. And each of those choices carried its own risks. Seeking help meant trusting someone else's skill and accepting the possibility of a painful procedure. Enduring meant living with uncertainty, not knowing whether the condition would stabilize or worsen. Self-treatment meant relying on remedies that might or might not be effective. There is no single typical outcome here. Some people would have found relief. Others would have lost teeth earlier than they might have otherwise. Some would have carried chronic pain for years. Others might have faced more serious complications. And beneath all of this, there is a quieter question about resilience. Not in the sense of heroic endurance, but in the everyday sense of adapting to conditions that cannot easily be changed. Medieval people adjusted their eating, their speaking, their sleeping, their expectations. They learned to live with imperfection in a way that modern systems often allow us to avoid. But that adaptation had limits. There were points at which the body simply could not compensate any longer. Points at which the balance tipped from discomfort into crisis. If we follow that line, those moments where ordinary problems become something more, we begin to move toward the situations where dental issues intersect with broader medical realities in ways that could become genuinely dangerous. Infection that spreads beyond the tooth. Swelling that affects the face and throat. Fever that signals something deeper. Situations where the line between a local problem and a systemic threat becomes very thin. And it is at that threshold, where the familiar discomfort of bad teeth begins to cross into something more uncertain and more serious, that the medieval experience of dental health reveals another layer, one that connects the quiet, daily reality of the mouth to the larger, sometimes precarious condition of the body itself, just as these slow changes in diet and environment continue to unfold in the background. Because once infection moved beyond the confines of a single tooth, the situation could change with a kind of quiet speed that would have felt both confusing and frightening. A swelling that began in the gum might extend into the jaw. The face could become visibly altered, not in a dramatic, theatrical way, but in a slow, undeniable expansion that made eating, speaking, and even resting more difficult. The skin might grow warm, the pressure might deepen, and for the person experiencing it, the sense of control could begin to slip away. In a world without the language of bacteria or systemic infection, these changes were interpreted through signs that were felt rather than fully explained. Heat suggested imbalance. Swelling suggested trapped matter. Pain that spread suggested something moving within the body. These interpretations were not random. They were attempts to make sense of patterns that were consistently observed, even if the underlying mechanisms remained hidden. And here, the limits of intervention became especially clear. What had once been a localized problem, a single damaged tooth, was now something larger. The remedies that might soothe a sore gum or dull an ache were no longer sufficient. The question became whether the body itself could contain the problem, whether it could draw it out, reduce it, or adapt to it in time. Sometimes it could. The human body has always possessed a capacity for partial recovery, for containing damage, for stabilizing conditions that might otherwise worsen. A swelling might eventually reduce. Pain might recede to a dull background presence. A tooth might die in place, no longer acutely painful, but no longer truly alive either. These were not clean resolutions, but they were survivable ones. At other times, however, the progression did not slow. Infection could deepen. Fever could appear, not as a separate illness, but as part of the body's response to something it could not easily resolve. The person might grow weaker, not only from the infection itself, but from the cumulative effects of pain, reduced eating, poor sleep, and general strain. This is the point at which dental health, something that might seem small or localized from a modern perspective, reveals its full significance in a medieval context. Without effective means to halt infection, without reliable ways to support recovery once the body was under strain, the consequences of a bad tooth could extend far beyond the mouth. And yet, even here, the response was not passive. People continued to act. They sought help when they could. They applied treatments that had been passed down, tested, or trusted within their communities. They adapted their behavior, their diet, their routines, in response to what their bodies were telling them. There is a kind of quiet determination in that, one that is easy to overlook if we focus only on the limitations. Medieval life did not offer easy solutions, but it did not lack effort. People worked within the boundaries of their world, trying to manage conditions that, from their perspective, were neither mysterious nor trivial, but deeply real and often deeply disruptive. If we look more closely at how these situations unfolded, we begin to notice another pattern, one that ties dental health to broader cycles of vulnerability. Illness rarely appeared in isolation. A person weakened by one condition was often more susceptible to another. Poor nutrition could affect the gums. Gum disease could affect eating. Reduced eating could weaken the body further. The boundaries between different forms of illness were not neatly separated. They overlapped, reinforced one another, and sometimes accelerated each other in ways that were difficult to interrupt. This interconnectedness is one of the reasons dental problems could become so persistent. Even if the original cause was relatively simple, a cracked tooth, a cavity, a minor infection, the surrounding conditions could prevent recovery. The body might not have the strength to heal fully. The environment might not support rest or change. The problem could settle into a kind of uneasy stability, never fully resolved, never entirely gone. And this, in turn, shaped how people understood time. Modern medicine often divides illness into stages, with clear expectations about progression and recovery. In the medieval world, the experience of illness could feel more uncertain. A problem might improve, then worsen, then stabilize, then flare again. There was no guarantee of a clear end point. Instead, there was a sense of living with conditions that shifted, sometimes subtly, sometimes suddenly. For the mouth, this meant that a person's relationship with their own teeth could change gradually over years. A tooth that once caused sharp pain might become tolerable, then problematic again. Another tooth might begin to fail. The overall condition of the mouth could decline unevenly, not all at once, but piece by piece, each change influencing the next. At the same time, these personal experiences were part of a larger pattern that extended across communities. If many people in a region shared similar diets, similar working conditions, similar environmental exposures, then certain dental problems would appear more frequently. They would become familiar, almost expected, not because they were harmless, but because they were common. And familiarity has a quiet effect on perception. It can reduce fear in some cases, but it can also reduce urgency. If a condition is widely shared, it may not stand out as something that demands immediate intervention, especially when intervention itself is limited. A toothache becomes part of life, something to be managed rather than solved. This does not mean people accepted suffering without question, but it does mean that their expectations were shaped by what was possible. They did not measure their experience against a standard of complete comfort or perfect health, because such a standard was not available to them. Instead, they measured it against the conditions around them, against what others experienced, against what could realistically be changed. And within that framework, even small improvements mattered. A remedy that reduced pain for a few hours could be valuable. A successful extraction, even if painful in the moment, could be a turning point. A change in diet, a period of rest, a supportive household, these could all influence outcomes in ways that were meaningful, even if they did not eliminate the underlying risks. There is also something to be said about how these experiences were remembered and shared. Knowledge about dental care, such as it was, did not exist only in written texts. It circulated through conversation, through observation, through imitation. People learned from one another. They noticed what seemed to help, what seemed to harm, what was worth trying, what was best avoided. This kind of knowledge was not systematic in the modern sense, but it was cumulative. Over time, patterns emerged. Certain herbs were used repeatedly. Certain practices became common. Some ideas persisted because they seemed to align with experience, even if the reasons behind them were not fully understood. And yet, for all of this accumulated knowledge, there remained a persistent gap between what people could observe and what they could control. The mouth, with its hidden surfaces and internal processes, resisted easy management. Problems often became visible only after they had already advanced. By the time pain appeared, the underlying issue might already be well established. This delay is another subtle but important factor. It means that medieval dental problems were often discovered late, not because people were inattentive, but because the early stages were not easily detectable. Without mirrors of sufficient quality, without artificial lighting, without the habit of regular inspection, the inside of the mouth remained partially hidden. A person might sense something was wrong, but not see it clearly. And so, the experience of dental decline often carried an element of surprise. A sudden pain, a tooth that felt different, a change that could not be easily explained. These moments disrupted the sense of continuity, introducing uncertainty into a part of the body that was otherwise taken for granted. If we follow that uncertainty a little further, it begins to intersect with another aspect of medieval life that is easy to overlook: the role of belief not just in formal medicine, but in everyday understanding. People did not separate physical and spiritual explanations in the way modern thinking often does. Illness could be seen as part of a broader moral or cosmic order, influenced by behavior, environment, and forces that extended beyond the immediate body. This did not replace practical responses. A person with a toothache still sought relief, but it added another layer to how that pain was interpreted. Could be a test, a sign, a consequence, or simply part of the human condition. These interpretations shaped how people endured suffering, how they explained it to themselves, and how they responded to it within their communities. And as these layers of experience, physical, social, environmental, and interpretive, continue to overlap, the story of medieval teeth becomes less about a single cause and more about a network of influences, all moving slowly, sometimes invisibly, shaping outcomes over time. Which brings us, quite naturally, to a point where individual experience begins to connect more directly with larger historical shifts, where the accumulation of small, personal problems starts to reflect broader changes in diet, trade, medical thinking, and daily life, changes that are still unfolding and that will begin to alter not only how teeth fail, but how people begin to think about preserving them in the first place. Because for much of the earlier medieval period, preservation was not yet a central idea. People responded to problems, managed discomfort, and adapted to decline, but the concept of actively maintaining the teeth over a lifetime, of preventing deterioration before it began, remained limited, scattered, and inconsistent. That was not due to a lack of care, but to the absence of a clear, shared framework that connected daily habits to long-term outcomes in a reliable way. Yet slowly, almost imperceptibly, that framework begins to take shape. Part of this shift comes from the gradual expansion of written medical knowledge. As texts are copied, translated, and circulated, often through monastic centers or learned communities, ideas about the body begin to move more widely. Not quickly, not evenly, but enough to create pockets of more structured thinking about health. Within these texts, the mouth does appear, sometimes as a minor topic, sometimes as part of broader discussions about digestion, breath, or bodily balance. What is interesting is not that these texts suddenly solve dental problems, they do not, but that they begin to treat the mouth as something that can be maintained, not just endured. There are recommendations about cleaning, about diet, about avoiding certain substances, about supporting the gums. These are not systematic in the modern sense, but they represent a subtle shift in emphasis. The idea that daily behavior might influence long-term condition begins to gain a little more clarity. At the same time, material culture is changing in ways that support this shift, even if indirectly. Cloth becomes more available. Small personal items become more common. The idea of carrying something, however simple, to clean the teeth or freshen the mouth becomes slightly more feasible in certain contexts. Not universal, not widespread across all classes, but present enough to matter. And then there is the influence of contact between cultures. Medieval Europe was not isolated. Trade routes connected it to the Islamic world, to parts of Asia, to regions where medical knowledge had developed along different lines. In some of these regions, practices related to oral hygiene, such as the use of chewing sticks with natural antimicrobial properties, were more established. These practices did not transfer instantly or completely, but ideas moved. Observations were made. Techniques were sometimes adopted, adapted, or at least noted. This exchange does not transform medieval dental care overnight, but it adds another layer to the gradual evolution of thinking. The mouth becomes not only a site of pain or decline, but a site where small, deliberate actions might make a difference. Still, these changes unfold unevenly. For many people, daily life remains much as it was. Food is still shaped by necessity. Work still demands endurance. Access to knowledge and resources is still limited. The gap between what might be known in a text and what can be practiced in a household remains wide. And yet, even within that gap, something shifts in perception. A person might begin to notice that certain foods worsen discomfort, that rinsing the mouth brings temporary relief, that cleaning the teeth, however roughly, feels beneficial. These observations, repeated and shared, begin to form a kind of practical awareness that sits alongside formal knowledge. This is not a sudden awakening. It is a slow accumulation of small recognitions. At the same time, the role of sugar continues to develop in the background, quietly reshaping dental health in ways that are not immediately obvious. As trade expands and access increases, sugar begins to move beyond its earlier status as a rare or medicinal substance among elites. It remains expensive, but it appears more frequently, in more varied forms, in more places. What makes this shift particularly significant is that sugar does not behave like the abrasive elements of earlier diets. It does not wear the teeth down through friction. Instead, it interacts with the environment of the mouth in a way that promotes decay from within. And because this process is less visible in its early stages, it can progress without immediate detection. For those who have access to sugar, especially in concentrated or repeated forms, the experience of dental deterioration may begin to feel different. Teeth that once might have lasted longer under abrasive will now begin to develop cavities that deepen over time. Pain may appear in new patterns. The progression of damage changes its rhythm. This creates a kind of quiet divergence within medieval society. Different groups, depending on their access to certain foods, begin to experience dental problems in slightly different ways. The wealthy, who might enjoy sweeter diets, encounter one pattern of decay. The poor, whose diets remain more coarse and abrasive, encounter another. Neither is free from dental problems, but the causes and experiences begin to vary more distinctly. And this variation feeds back into perception. It shapes what people notice, what they attribute problems to, what they believe can be controlled. It complicates the already complex picture of dental health, adding new layers without removing the old ones. Meanwhile, the tools and techniques available to practitioners continue to evolve slowly. Instruments are refined, sometimes subtly, sometimes more noticeably. Experience accumulates. Certain methods become more reliable, not in the sense of modern precision, but in the sense of being more consistently effective than alternatives. There are also early, tentative attempts at more restorative approaches. These are limited, often experimental, and not widely accessible. But they represent another small shift in thinking, the idea that a tooth might be treated, not only removed. That damage might be managed, not just eliminated. Again, these developments are not transformative in a broad sense. They do not change the everyday reality for most people. But they mark the beginning of a different approach to the mouth, one that will, over time, lead to more significant changes. If we pause for a moment within this gradual transition, there is an interesting contrast to consider. On one hand, the medieval experience of dental health remains deeply shaped by limitation, by the absence of effective prevention, by the risks of intervention, by the persistence of pain. On the other hand, there is a growing sense, however faint, that the condition of the mouth is not entirely beyond influence. That contrast creates a kind of tension within the period. People live with the reality of what cannot be easily changed, while beginning to sense that some aspects of it might be. And this tension becomes more visible when we look at how individuals respond over time. A younger person might observe the condition of older relatives, noticing patterns of tooth loss or decay. They might adopt certain habits, avoid certain foods when possible, or pay more attention to discomfort. Not because they expect to avoid all problems, but because they recognize the possibility of influencing the outcome, even slightly. This is where the story begins to shift from pure endurance toward cautious intention. But intention alone is not enough to overcome the structural limits of the period. Even as awareness grows, the environment remains challenging. Food quality varies. Work remains demanding. Medical knowledge is still incomplete. And the tools required for effective prevention and treatment are still in their early stages. So the experience of dental health continues to be marked by a kind of imbalance between what is known and what can be done, between what is observed and what can be controlled. And yet, it is precisely within that imbalance that change begins to take root. Because as these small shifts in awareness, practice, and material culture continue to accumulate, they begin to influence not only individual behavior, but broader patterns of thought. The mouth, once primarily a site of reaction, begins very slowly to be seen as something that can be cared for more deliberately. This does not erase the older patterns of decay, wear, and infection. Those remain very much present. But alongside them, a new layer of possibility begins to emerge, still fragile, still incomplete, but increasingly difficult to ignore. And as this layer grows, it starts to intersect with other developments. Changes in diet, in trade, in urban life, in the circulation of knowledge, in ways that will gradually reshape the entire landscape of dental health, carrying the story forward into a period where the balance between endurance and intervention begins, at last, to shift. Because once that balance begins to move, even slightly, it reveals something that had been present all along but rarely articulated. That the condition of the mouth was not only a matter of individual experience, but part of a broader structure shaped by economy, access, and habit. What people could eat, how often they ate, what tools they possessed, and what knowledge they trusted, all of these factors began to interact in more visible ways. In larger towns, for instance, the availability of food continued to expand, but so did its inconsistency. A person might one day consume relatively coarse bread, and another day something softer, more refined, perhaps even slightly sweetened. These fluctuations, repeated over time, created a more varied environment within the mouth itself. The teeth were no longer exposed to a single, predictable pattern of wear or decay, but to shifting conditions that made outcomes less uniform. And this lack of uniformity made observation more complicated. It became harder to say that one type of food or one habit always led to a specific result. Some people seemed to retain their teeth longer than others, even within similar conditions. Others experienced rapid decline. The reasons were not always clear, and this uncertainty contributed to a growing sense that dental health was influenced by multiple, interacting causes rather than a single, obvious one. At the same time, the sensory experience of the mouth, taste, texture, smell, remained a constant guide. People learned through feeling as much as through instruction. They noticed which foods left the mouth feeling clean or coated, which drinks soothed irritation or intensified it, which habits seemed to reduce discomfort, even if only temporarily. This kind of embodied knowledge did not require formal explanation. It was immediate, repeatable, and deeply persuasive. There is something almost quiet and experimental about this process, not in the sense of deliberate scientific testing, but in the sense of small adjustments made over time. A different way of rinsing, a different choice of food when possible, a habit of rubbing the teeth after eating. None of these actions guaranteed protection, but together they began to form patterns of care that, however limited, marked a shift away from purely reactive behavior. And yet, even as these patterns emerged, they coexisted with older realities that remained stubbornly unchanged. The quality of grain still varied. Millstones still introduced grit. Work still required the body to endure long hours with little rest. Illness still arrived unpredictably. The body still aged in ways that could not be reversed. This coexistence of change and continuity is one of the most important features of the period. It reminds us that historical transformation rarely replaces one system entirely with another. Instead, new ideas and practices layer themselves over existing ones, creating a complex mixture of old and new that unfolds gradually. Within that mixture, the figure of the practitioner becomes slightly more defined. Not yet a dentist in the modern sense, but someone whose role begins to focus more clearly on the mouth. In some places, specialization starts to appear, however faintly. Individuals who have experience with teeth, who have extracted many, who understand certain patterns of pain, who are known within their communities, begin to stand out. Their knowledge is still practical, still rooted in experience rather than formalized science, but it carries weight. People seek them out not only in moments of crisis, but sometimes earlier, when discomfort begins. This shift is subtle but significant. It suggests a growing recognition that intervention, even if limited, might be more effective when it is not delayed until the last possible moment. At the same time, the tools associated with these practitioners continue to evolve in small but meaningful ways. Instruments become more varied. Grips improve. Techniques are refined through repetition. There is no sudden leap forward, no single invention that transforms the field, but rather a steady accumulation of incremental improvements. These improvements, in turn, influence expectations. If extraction can sometimes be done more cleanly, more reliably, then the threshold for seeking help may shift slightly. If certain remedies are known to provide relief, they may be used more consistently. Over time, these changes begin to alter the rhythm of how dental problems are managed within communities. And yet, For all of this, the fundamental vulnerability of the mouth remains. It is still exposed, still active, still subject to constant use. It is still a place where small problems can grow quietly until they demand attention. The difference is that people are beginning, in small ways, to anticipate those problems rather than only respond to them. This anticipation is not always conscious. It does not take the form of a clear plan or a structured routine. Instead, it appears as a series of habits, preferences, and small decisions that, taken together, begin to shape outcomes over time. There is also a growing awareness of the connection between diet and condition, even if the mechanisms are not fully understood. Certain foods are recognized as better or worse for the body, including the mouth. Rich, sweet, or overly refined foods may be associated with discomfort, while simpler, more familiar foods are seen as safer, though not necessarily beneficial in every respect. This awareness is uneven, sometimes contradictory, but it reflects an attempt to link cause and effect in a more deliberate way. It is another step towards seeing dental health as something influenced by daily choices, even within a constrained environment. Meanwhile, the broader changes in trade and economy continue to exert their influence. As goods move more freely, as markets expand, as new items become available, the range of possible diets increases. This does not mean that everyone benefits equally. Access remains tied to wealth, location, and circumstance, but the overall landscape becomes more varied. And with that variation comes new patterns of dental experience. In some regions, diets become slightly softer, slightly more processed. In others, traditional patterns persist. In some communities, new substances like sugar begin to appear more regularly. In others, they remain rare. These differences begin to create a more complex picture of dental health across the medieval world. It is no longer possible to speak of a single, uniform experience. Instead, there are multiple overlapping patterns, each shaped by its own combination of factors. If we look closely at this moment, there is a sense of something preparing to change more noticeably, even if the full transformation has not yet arrived. The ingredients are there: growing awareness, evolving practices, expanding trade, increasing variation in diet, gradual refinement of techniques. What is still missing is the kind of unified understanding that would bring these elements together into a coherent system of care. That will come later, in stages, as knowledge continues to accumulate and as the boundaries between observation and explanation begin to narrow. For now, the medieval mouth remains a place where endurance and adaptation coexist with emerging forms of intention, where pain is still common, but not entirely unquestioned, where decline is still expected, but not entirely unexamined. And as these layers continue to build, they begin to push the story toward a point where the experience of dental health will no longer be shaped only by what cannot be changed, but increasingly by what people begin, slowly and unevenly, to understand they might be able to influence, setting the stage for a deeper shift that is already beginning to take form beneath the surface. That deeper shift does not arrive as a single moment. It emerges through a quiet reordering of attention. The mouth, which had long been something people responded to only when it demanded notice, begins, very gradually, to attract a more continuous kind of awareness. Not constant, not systematic, but more frequent, more deliberate. Part of this comes from a growing sensitivity to early discomfort. Where once a faint irritation might have been ignored entirely, it is now more likely to be noticed, perhaps even interpreted as the beginning of something that could worsen. This does not always lead to effective intervention, but it changes the timing of response. The gap between the first sign of trouble and the decision to act begins, in some cases, to narrow. And timing matters. Even in a world without advanced treatment, earlier action can alter outcomes. A tooth that is addressed while it is still manageable may avoid the deeper infection that follows neglect. A mouth that is kept relatively clean may slow the progression of gum disease. These are not guarantees, but they introduce a new variable into the equation: the possibility that attention itself has value. At the same time, the environments in which people live are also shifting in ways that affect how the mouth is experienced. In more densely populated towns, for example, the rhythms of daily life become slightly more structured. Meals may occur at more regular times. Certain foods become associated with particular settings or occasions. This regularity, however subtle, creates opportunities for routine, moments where habits can form and repeat. A person who rinses their mouth after eating, not because of a formal instruction but because it has become a small, repeated act, is participating in a pattern that, over time, can influence their condition. The act itself is simple. The significance lies in its repetition. There is also a growing interplay between practicality and appearance. As social interactions become more varied, through trade, through movement between communities, through expanding networks of exchange, the way a person presents themselves can carry slightly more weight. The mouth, as part of that presentation, becomes a quiet point of attention. This does not mean that medieval society suddenly adopts modern standards of dental aesthetics. But it does mean that the condition of the teeth, the freshness of the breath, the ability to speak clearly and comfortably, all begin to matter in slightly more visible ways within certain contexts. These concerns remain secondary to survival, to work, to daily necessity, but they are no longer entirely invisible. And once something becomes visible, even in a limited way, it begins to influence behavior. There is a subtle but important shift here, one that moves from the purely functional toward the partly expressive. Teeth are still tools. They are still used, worn, and sometimes lost. But they are also part of how a person is perceived, and that perception begins to feed back into how the mouth is cared for. At the same time, the gradual refinement of medical thinking continues to play a role, even if its reach is uneven. Learned practitioners, drawing on older traditions while incorporating new observations, begin to articulate more nuanced ideas about the body. The mouth is still not the center of medical attention, but it is no longer entirely peripheral either. There are discussions about the importance of cleanliness, about the role of diet, about the need to maintain balance within the body. These ideas do not form a complete or accurate system by modern standards, but they contribute to a broader atmosphere in which health is seen as something that can be influenced through daily habits. This atmosphere does not transform everyone's behavior, but it creates a kind of background expectation, a sense that certain practices are beneficial, even if they are not always followed consistently. And within households, these expectations can take on a more personal form. Parents observe the condition of their children's teeth. They notice differences between siblings, between generations. They may encourage certain habits, discourage others, based on what they have seen. These small acts of guidance are rarely recorded, but they are part of how knowledge moves through time. The result is a slow, almost invisible transmission of practical awareness. Not formal education, not structured instruction, but a kind of lived knowledge that accumulates within families and communities. Yet for all of this, the limits remain firmly in place. A person can pay attention to their mouth, can adopt small habits, can respond earlier to discomfort and still experience decay, pain, and loss. The underlying conditions have not disappeared. They have only become slightly more manageable in certain cases. This creates a kind of dual experience. On one level, there is a growing sense of agency, however limited. On another, there is a persistent recognition that many outcomes remain beyond control. The tension between these two realities becomes part of everyday life. And it is within this tension that new forms of response begin to emerge. Some are practical, grounded in observation and repetition. Others are more speculative, shaped by evolving medical theories or cultural beliefs. Together, They form a landscape of care that is more complex than it first appears. If we follow this landscape a little further, we begin to see how it intersects with another important factor: time itself, not just as a measure of age, but as a measure of change across generations. What one generation accepts as inevitable, the next may begin to question, even slightly. What once seemed beyond influence may come to be seen as partially manageable. These shifts are rarely dramatic, but they accumulate. A person who grows up observing older relatives with severe dental problems may approach their own health differently, even if only in small ways. They may adopt certain habits earlier. They may seek help sooner. They may interpret discomfort differently. These changes do not eliminate risk, but they alter the pattern of experience. And over time, as these altered patterns repeat across many individuals, they begin to shape broader trends. This is where the story moves beyond individual lives and into something more collective. The gradual change in how people think about their teeth, how they care for them, how they respond to problems, begins to influence the overall character of dental health within a community. Not uniformly, not completely, but enough to create a sense that something is shifting. At the same time, external forces continue to press in. Trade routes expand further. Goods move more freely. Diets diversify. Urban life becomes more complex. Each of these changes introduces new variables into the equation, sometimes improving conditions, sometimes complicating them. For example, softer foods may reduce mechanical wear on the teeth, but increase the risk of decay. Greater access to certain ingredients may improve nutrition in some cases, while introducing new risks in others. The relationship between diet and dental health becomes more intricate, less predictable. This complexity is important because it challenges the idea that progress moves in a straight line. Improvements in one area can create new problems in another. Solutions are rarely simple, and outcomes are rarely uniform. And yet, within this complexity, there is a growing sense of inquiry. People observe differences. They notice patterns. They begin, in small ways, to ask why certain things happen. These questions do not always lead to clear answers, but they mark a shift in attitude. The mouth is no longer just a site of experience. It is becoming, slowly, a subject of curiosity. That curiosity, combined with the gradual accumulation of knowledge, the refinement of practice, and the changing conditions of daily life, sets the stage for a more noticeable transformation in how dental health is approached. But at this point in the story, that transformation is still incomplete. It exists more as a direction than a reality, more as a series of small movements than a single decisive change. And so the medieval mouth remains, for now, a place where endurance and emerging awareness continue to coexist, where the past still holds its influence, even as the future begins, quietly, to take shape just beyond it. That quiet shaping becomes easier to notice if we shift our attention slightly, from the individual experience of pain and response to the rhythms of everyday life that surround it. Because dental health was not only affected by what people ate or how they treated discomfort, but by when they ate, how often, and under what conditions. In earlier medieval patterns, meals were often structured by necessity rather than preference. Work dictated timing. Availability dictated content. For many, eating was not a constant activity but something that occurred in more defined intervals, shaped by labor, daylight, and season. This meant that the mouth experienced periods of activity followed by periods of relative rest. As time moves forward, particularly in more developed urban environments, this rhythm begins to loosen. Food becomes more accessible at different times of day. Small purchases, shared snacks, or prepared items allow for more frequent eating, even if in modest amounts. This change may seem minor, but it introduces a new dynamic. The teeth are exposed to food, and especially to residues, more often. Without the concept of continuous oral hygiene as we understand it today, this increased frequency has consequences. The mouth spends less time in a neutral state. Residues linger. The conditions that allow decay to progress become more consistent. Again, this is not something people would have described in these terms, but they would have felt the difference. A mouth that seems more often coated, more often uncomfortable, more prone to lingering taste or irritation. These sensations, repeated over time, contribute to a growing awareness that something about daily patterns is shifting. At the same time, cooking practices themselves evolve in subtle ways. As kitchens become more specialized in wealthier households, as ingredients become more varied, the texture and composition of food change. Sauces, stews, sweetened preparations, these begin to appear more frequently in certain contexts. Such foods can be easier to eat, especially for those already experiencing dental problems. They require less force, less chewing, less strain. In that sense, they offer a kind of relief, but they also adhere differently to the teeth. They linger. They interact with the mouth in ways that are less immediately obvious, but more persistent. This creates another quiet contradiction. Foods that make eating easier for damaged teeth may also contribute to further decay. Comfort and deterioration begin, in some cases, to move together rather than apart. Meanwhile, the role of alcohol, particularly ale and wine, remains an important part of daily life. These drinks are not simply indulgences. They are often safer than water, more reliable in certain contexts, and deeply integrated into social and nutritional routines. But they also affect the mouth, sometimes drying it, sometimes leaving residues, sometimes interacting with food in ways that influence dental condition. Again, the effect is not singular or easily defined. It varies with quantity, quality, and individual condition. But it adds another layer to the environment in which teeth exist, an environment that is becoming gradually more complex. If we return to the body itself, we can begin to see how these external changes interact with internal ones. The health of the gums, for example, is influenced not only by what touches them directly, but by the overall condition of the body. Nutrition, illness, stress, and age all play a role. In periods of scarcity, when diets are limited and deficiencies more likely, the gums may weaken. They may bleed more easily, recede more quickly, provide less stable support for the teeth. In periods of relative abundance, these conditions may improve slightly, but not always consistently. This fluctuation means that dental health is rarely stable over long periods. It rises and falls with the broader circumstances of life. A person might experience improvement during one phase, only to face decline in another. And this instability reinforces a certain kind of outlook, one that is neither entirely passive nor fully confident. People act when they can, adapt when they must, and accept when there is no clear alternative. Within this context, the act of tooth loss takes on a particular significance. Losing a tooth is not only the removal of pain, it is also the removal of function. Each missing tooth changes how the mouth works. It shifts the balance of chewing, places more pressure on the remaining teeth. It alters the way food is processed. Over time, these changes accumulate. The loss of one tooth makes the loss of another more likely. The structure of the mouth adjusts, sometimes unevenly. Chewing becomes less efficient. Certain foods are avoided, not by choice, but by necessity. And here again, we see how a dental problem extends into broader life. The inability to chew certain foods can affect nutrition, can limit options. It can influence social participation, especially in settings where food is shared. There is also a quieter psychological dimension. The awareness of missing teeth, of altered appearance, of changed speech, can shape how a person sees themselves and how they engage with others. This is not always expressed openly, but it is part of the lived experience. At the same time, people find ways to adapt. They soften food, choose different textures, adjust their habits. These adaptations are often practical, sometimes ingenious, but they also reflect the underlying reality that loss is being managed rather than reversed. If we step back slightly, we can begin to see how all of these elements, diet, rhythm, environment, adaptation, are converging toward a more complex understanding of dental health, even if that understanding is not yet fully articulated. There is a growing sense that the mouth is influenced by patterns, by repetition, by the accumulation of small effects over time. That what happens today may shape what happens months or years later. That the condition of the teeth is not only a matter of sudden events, but of gradual processes. This sense remains incomplete, but it is becoming harder to ignore. And as it becomes more visible, it begins to influence not only individual behavior, but also the way knowledge is recorded and shared. More attention is given to describing symptoms, to noting outcomes, to distinguishing between different kinds of dental problems. These descriptions, while still framed within older medical theories, begin to carry more detail. They reflect closer observation, a greater interest in distinguishing one condition from another. This, in turn, supports more targeted responses, even if those responses remain limited in effectiveness. It is a slow movement toward specificity, toward seeing the mouth not as a single, uniform site of pain, but as a place where different problems have different characteristics and perhaps eventually different approaches. And as this movement continues, it begins to intersect with another important development: the increasing availability of written material beyond strictly medical texts. Manuals, guides, and practical works, some aimed at household management, others at personal conduct, begin to include references to health and hygiene, including the care of the mouth. These references are often brief, sometimes secondary, but they contribute to a wider circulation of ideas. The notion that the mouth should be attended to, that certain practices are beneficial, begins to reach a broader audience. This does not create uniform change. Access to such material remains uneven. Literacy varies. Interpretation differs. But it adds another channel through which awareness can spread. And awareness, even when incomplete, has a way of accumulating. If we follow this accumulation just a little further, we begin to approach a point where the combined effect of these small shifts, changes in diet, in routine, in observation, in communication, starts to alter the overall trajectory of dental health in more noticeable ways. Not suddenly, not universally, but enough to suggest that the balance is continuing to move. And as that balance moves, it carries with it a growing sense that the mouth, once largely governed by necessity and limitation, is becoming slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably something that people are beginning to engage with more consciously, even as the deeper transformations that will reshape it are still gathering momentum. Just a head point, one of the clearest ways to see this shift is to look at how small, repeated actions begin to acquire meaning over time. What might once have been an occasional response, rinsing the mouth after a meal, rubbing the teeth with cloth or ash, chewing certain herbs for freshness, starts, in some contexts, to become more habitual. Not universal, not enforced, but repeated often enough to suggest a pattern. These habits are rarely framed as prevention in the modern sense. They are described in terms of comfort, cleanliness, or balance. A cleaner mouth feels better. A fresher breath is more pleasant. A reduced sense of irritation is noticeable. But behind these immediate experiences, something else is happening. The mouth is being attended to not only when it fails, but while it still functions. This distinction is subtle but important. It marks the beginning of a shift from reaction to maintenance, even if that maintenance remains imperfect and incomplete. At the same time, the experience of dental pain itself begins to influence how people think about time and anticipation. A person who has suffered a severe toothache does not forget it easily. The memory lingers, shaping expectations. It creates a kind of quiet caution, a readiness to act earlier the next time discomfort appears. This memory-based awareness is not theoretical. It is practical, grounded in lived experience. It spreads through conversation, through observation, through the shared recognition of what certain kinds of pain feel like and how they tend to progress. In this way, knowledge about dental problems becomes more experiential and less abstract. It is not learned from a single source, but built from many small encounters with the body itself. And yet, even as awareness grows, the unpredictability of outcomes remains a constant presence. Two people with similar habits may experience very different results. One may retain most of their teeth well into later life. Another may lose several by middle age. These differences are not always easily explained, and they reinforce a sense that while behavior matters, it does not fully determine the outcome. This uncertainty shapes how people approach care. It encourages effort, but also caution. It allows for adaptation, but does not promise control. Meanwhile, the environments in which people live continue to evolve in ways that subtly influence the mouth. In some regions, improvements in milling technology reduce the amount of grit in flour. This change, while technical and gradual, has a direct effect on dental wear. Teeth may experience less abrasion, less mechanical damage over time. But as before, this improvement is accompanied by new complications. Finer flour produces softer bread, which can adhere more easily to the teeth. It changes the texture of eating, the way food interacts with the mouth. What is gained in one area may be offset in another. This pattern of improvement and complication arriving together repeats across many aspects of medieval life. It is part of what makes the story of dental health so layered. There is no single direction of progress. Instead, there is a continuous negotiation between different forces, each shaping the outcome in its own way. In more prosperous households, this negotiation becomes particularly visible. Access to a wider range of foods, including those that are softer, sweeter, or more refined, creates both opportunity and risk. The mouth becomes a site where the benefits of wealth, variety, comfort, abundance interact with its unintended consequences. A person in such a household might enjoy foods that are easier to chew, more pleasurable to taste, more varied in composition. But these same foods may contribute to patterns of decay that are less immediately noticeable, yet more persistent over time. This creates a quiet irony. The very conditions that improve quality of life in one sense can introduce new forms of vulnerability in another. And within these households, the response to dental problems may also begin to change. There may be greater willingness to seek out practitioners earlier, to experiment with different remedies, to invest time and resources in managing discomfort. These responses do not eliminate the underlying limitations, but they alter the experience of living with them. In contrast, in less affluent settings, the balance remains more firmly weighted toward endurance. Access to varied foods is limited. Work demands are constant. Time for deliberate care is scarce. Here, the mouth continues to be shaped primarily by necessity, by what is available, by what must be done each day. And yet, even within these constraints, the same patterns of awareness begin to appear. Small habits, shared observations, cautious responses. The shift is slower, more constrained, but it is present. If we look across these different contexts, urban and rural, wealthy and poor, we begin to see a mosaic of experiences, each reflecting the interplay of local conditions and broader changes. Dental health is no longer a single, uniform story. It is a collection of overlapping narratives, each shaped by its own set of influences. This diversity of experience also affects how knowledge is understood and valued. In some places, written texts may carry authority. In others, practical experience may be more trusted. In many cases, the two exist side by side, sometimes reinforcing each other, sometimes diverging. For example, a learned recommendation about cleaning the teeth might align with a household practice that has been passed down through generations. In such cases, the idea gains strength. It feels confirmed both by authority and by experience. In other cases, a recommendation may seem impractical or ineffective in a particular context. It may be ignored, adapted, or replaced by something else. This process of selection and adaptation is part of how knowledge evolves within real conditions. And as knowledge evolves, so too does expectation. People begin to develop a sense, however vague, of what is normal for the mouth and what is not. They learn to distinguish between minor discomfort and something more serious. They begin to recognize patterns that suggest when action might be necessary. This recognition does not always lead to successful outcomes, but it changes the way problems are perceived. It introduces a layer of interpretation that sits between sensation and response. There is also a growing awareness of the role of age, not just as an inevitable process, but as something that interacts with other factors. A younger person with poor dental health may be seen differently from an older person with similar conditions. Age provides a context, a way of understanding why certain changes occur. This contextual thinking adds another dimension to the story. It allows people to place their experiences within a broader framework, to compare themselves with others, to anticipate certain developments. And yet, even as this framework becomes more refined, it remains incomplete. There are still gaps, still uncertainties, still areas where cause and effect are not fully understood. These gaps are important because they leave room for continued observation, for continued questioning, for the gradual accumulation of insight. If we follow that process forward, we begin to approach a moment where the combination of awareness, practice, and changing conditions starts to create more noticeable differences over time. Not immediate transformation, but a slow divergence between those who adopt certain habits and those who do not, between those with access to certain resources and those without. These differences are not absolute, but they are meaningful. They suggest that the mouth is becoming, in a quiet way, a site where variation reflects choice as well as circumstance. And as this idea takes hold, even imperfectly, it begins to influence how people think about their own role in shaping their health. The medieval mouth, once experienced primarily as something that happened to a person, begins very gradually to be experienced as something that a person can, at least in part, act upon. This shift is still fragile. It does not yet overturn the deeper structures that govern dental health. But it introduces a new possibility, one that will continue to develop as the forces already in motion, trade, diet, knowledge, and daily practice, carry the story forward into the next stage of its slow and complex transformation. And that next stage becomes clearer when we begin to notice how attention itself starts to organize around the mouth in more deliberate ways. Not as a separate medical field yet, not as a clearly defined discipline, but as a growing area of concern that attracts more focused observation. In certain places, especially where learning is concentrated, in monasteries, in early universities, in centers of translation and scholarship, the body begins to be studied with slightly more precision. The mouth, still a small part of that larger inquiry, is nonetheless included. Descriptions become more careful. Distinctions between different kinds of dental problems become more apparent, even if the explanations remain incomplete. This does not immediately change everyday life for most people, but it creates a subtle shift in how knowledge is framed. The mouth is no longer only described in general terms of pain or imbalance. It begins slowly to be described in terms of parts, conditions, and processes. That shift in description matters because it allows for more targeted thinking. If one kind of tooth problem is not exactly the same as another, then perhaps it requires a different response. If gum issues behave differently from cavities, then perhaps they should be approached differently. These are small conceptual steps, but they open the door to a more nuanced understanding of dental health. At the same time, practical experience continues to accumulate among those who work directly with the mouth. Practitioners who perform extractions, who observe patterns of decay, who see the outcomes of different treatments, begin to build a kind of informal knowledge base. They may not write it down in systematic ways, but they carry it with them, applying it case by case. Over time, this experience can lead to more consistent approaches. A practitioner may recognize the signs of a tooth that is unlikely to recover and recommend removal earlier. They may identify situations where waiting leads to worse outcomes. They may refine their technique to reduce damage during extraction. Again, these are incremental improvements. They do not eliminate pain or risk, but they shape the experience in ways that are meaningful for those involved. Meanwhile, the broader environment continues to change in ways that influence the mouth from the outside. Climate variations, for example, can affect harvests, which in turn affect diet. A poor harvest may lead to reliance on less varied, less nutritious food. A good harvest may allow for greater diversity, better nourishment, and perhaps slightly improved overall health. These fluctuations create cycles of vulnerability and resilience within communities. During harder times, dental problems may worsen not only because of diet, but because the body itself is under greater strain. During better times, some recovery may occur, though often incomplete. This cyclical pattern reinforces the idea that dental health is not static. It is responsive, shaped by conditions that extend far beyond the mouth itself. And within these cycles, the role of age continues to evolve in perception. There is a growing recognition that while some degree of dental decline is associated with aging, the rate and extent of that decline can vary. This observation, simple as it may seem, challenges the idea that tooth loss is entirely inevitable or uniform. It introduces the possibility that differences in outcome are not only a matter of time, but of circumstance and behavior. This realization does not lead to immediate solutions, but it deepens the sense that the mouth is influenced by multiple factors that can interact in different ways. At the same time, the social dimension of dental health becomes more visible in certain contexts. In markets, in gatherings, in places where people interact more frequently with those outside their immediate household, the condition of the mouth can become part of how individuals are perceived. A person with severe dental problems may find certain interactions more difficult. Not necessarily excluded, but subtly affected. Speech, breath, appearance, all of these can influence how communication unfolds. This does not create a rigid system of judgment, but it adds another layer to the experience of dental health. It is not only about pain or function. It is also about participation, about ease of interaction, about the small ways in which the body shapes social life. And as these social dimensions become more apparent, they feed back into behavior. People may pay more attention to their mouths not only for comfort, but for confidence. They may adopt small practices that make them feel more at ease in the presence of others. These motivations are not always articulated, but they are felt. They become part of the quiet calculus that guides daily habits. If we follow this thread a little further, we begin to see how the accumulation of these small changes, practical, observational, social, starts to create a more defined space for the idea of dental care, even if that idea remains incomplete. The mouth is no longer just a site of reaction, nor is it fully a site of prevention. It exists somewhere in between, where attention is increasing, but control is still limited. This intermediate state is important because it represents a transition. It is a period in which the foundations of a more systematic approach are being laid, even if the structure itself is not yet built. And within this transition, there are moments where the old and the new coexist in particularly striking ways. A person might use a traditional remedy for tooth pain while also adopting a newer habit of cleaning their teeth more regularly. A practitioner might rely on long-established techniques while also incorporating observations that reflect more recent thinking. These combinations are not always consistent, but they reflect the reality of a world in which knowledge is evolving rather than replacing itself. At the same time, the broader movement of history continues to carry these developments forward. Trade expands further. Contact between regions increases. Ideas move more quickly, even if still unevenly. The accumulation of knowledge accelerates, not dramatically, but noticeably. And as this acceleration continues, it begins to influence not only what people know, but how they think about knowing. There is a growing emphasis in certain circles on observation, on comparison, on the careful recording of experience. This shift in intellectual approach, still in its early stages, will eventually have profound effects on many areas of life, including the understanding of the body. For now, it remains a background force, but one that is steadily gaining strength. If we return to the mouth within this context, we can begin to see how it is positioned at the intersection of many different influences: biological, environmental, social, and intellectual. It is a small part of the body, but one that reflects larger patterns in a particularly clear way. And as those larger patterns continue to evolve, the experience of dental health will continue to change with them, moving gradually away from a world defined almost entirely by endurance, and toward one where understanding and intervention begin, slowly but surely, to play a more significant role. But at this point in the story, that movement is still unfolding. The forces that will reshape the experience of teeth and dental care are gathering, interacting, and building momentum, even as the everyday reality of medieval life continues to be shaped by the familiar rhythms of work, food, and the quiet, persistent presence of the body itself, carrying forward into a moment where these accumulating changes will begin to take on a more visible and decisive form. That moment begins to emerge not through a sudden breakthrough, but through a gradual tightening of connections between observation, practice, and expectation. What had once existed as scattered habits and isolated insights starts, in certain places, to align more closely. Patterns are noticed not just individually, but comparatively. One person's experience is weighed against another's. Outcomes are discussed, remembered, and, in some cases, anticipated. This creates a subtle shift in how people interpret cause and effect. Where earlier explanations might have rested more heavily on broad ideas of imbalance or fate, there is now a growing tendency, still incomplete, still uncertain, to look for more specific links between behavior and result. Not in a fully systematic way, but in a way that suggests increasing attention to detail. For example, the repeated observation that certain foods seem to leave the mouth feeling worse, or that particular habits bring temporary relief, begins to carry more weight when it is shared across multiple experiences. These observations, when reinforced, start to feel less like coincidence and more like pattern. And once something is perceived as a pattern, it becomes easier to act upon. At the same time, the tools of daily life continue to evolve in ways that support these emerging patterns. Cloth, already in use for many purposes, becomes a more common medium for personal care. The act of wiping or rubbing the teeth, while simple, gains consistency in certain contexts. Powders, whether made from salt, herbs, or other materials, are applied with slightly more intention. These practices are not standardized. They vary widely in method and effectiveness, but they represent a growing willingness to intervene in the condition of the mouth before pain becomes severe. There is also a noticeable change in how discomfort is interpreted at its earliest stages. A slight sensitivity, once dismissed as unimportant, may now be recognized as the beginning of a problem. This recognition does not always lead to successful prevention, but it alters the sequence of response. Action, even if limited, begins earlier. And earlier action, even in a constrained system, can change outcomes in small but meaningful ways. At the same time, the social environment continues to exert its influence. In settings where interaction is frequent and varied, markets, workshops, gatherings, the condition of the mouth becomes part of a broader network of perception. A person's ability to speak clearly, to engage comfortably, to present themselves without noticeable discomfort, takes on subtle importance. This does not create a rigid standard, but it adds pressure in quiet ways. It encourages attention, even if only at the level of small, repeated habits. It reinforces the idea that the mouth is not only a private matter, but part of how one moves through the world. And within this environment, the role of practitioners continues to shift, almost imperceptibly, toward greater specialization. While still far from the distinct profession that will emerge later, there is a gradual narrowing of focus among those who work with the body. Some become more associated with certain types of procedures, certain kinds of knowledge. This association strengthens over time. People begin to recognize who is experienced with teeth, who has a reputation for effective extraction, who is known for particular remedies. These reputations are built not on formal credentials, but on repeated outcomes, on the accumulation of practical success or failure. As these reputations spread, they influence behavior. People may travel further to seek out a practitioner they trust. They may choose intervention earlier if they believe it will be handled more skillfully. These decisions, small in themselves, begin to alter the overall pattern of dental care within communities. At the same time, the intellectual environment continues to evolve. The careful observation of the body, still in its early stages, begins to emphasize not only what is seen, but how it is described. Language becomes more precise in certain contexts. Terms are used to distinguish between different kinds of pain, different conditions of the gums, different stages of decay. This precision does not yet translate into effective cures, but it creates a framework for thinking that is more structured. It allows for comparison, for classification, for the gradual building of a more detailed understanding. And as this framework develops, it begins to influence how knowledge is transmitted. Written texts, while still limited in reach, become slightly more systematic in their treatment of the body. Observations are recorded with greater care. Recommendations are presented with a clearer sense of context. At the same time, oral transmission, conversation, demonstration, shared experience continues to play a central role. The two forms of knowledge interact, sometimes reinforcing each other, sometimes diverging. Together, they create a dynamic system in which ideas are tested, adapted, and passed on. If we look closely at this system, we can begin to see how it supports the gradual emergence of a more deliberate approach to dental care. Not yet consistent, not yet reliable, but increasingly intentional. And yet, even as intention grows, the underlying vulnerabilities remain. The mouth is still exposed to constant use. It is still affected by diet, by environment, by the general condition of the body. It is still a place where small problems can become large ones without warning. This persistence of vulnerability ensures that the experience of dental health remains complex, cannot be reduced to a single cause or a single solution. It is shaped by a web of influences, each interacting with the others in ways that are not always predictable. But within that complexity, the direction of change becomes clearer. There is a movement, slow, uneven, but unmistakable, toward greater awareness, greater attention, and greater willingness to act. And as that movement continues, it begins to set the stage for a more visible transformation, one that will become increasingly apparent as the conditions of life continue to shift, carrying the story of the medieval mouth toward a point where the balance between suffering and intervention will begin to change in ways that are both subtle and profound. What becomes especially noticeable in this next phase is not a dramatic improvement in dental health, but a change in how decline is tracked over time. people begin, in quiet ways, to recognize sequences, how one problem leads to another, how the loss of a single tooth alters the pressure on the rest, how small irritations, if left unattended, tend to return in more persistent forms. This awareness of sequence introduces a different kind of thinking. It is no longer only about responding to the present moment, but about anticipating the next one. A person might notice that after losing a molar, chewing shifts to the opposite side. Over time, that side becomes more strained, more sensitive. Another tooth begins to weaken. The pattern, once experienced, becomes easier to recognize the next time it appears. These observations are rarely written down in formal ways, but they are remembered. They become part of how individuals understand their own bodies and how they advise others. A younger person might be warned, not in abstract terms, but through lived examples, what happened to a parent, a neighbor, a fellow worker. In this way, the mouth becomes a site of intergenerational knowledge, not only in terms of remedies, but in terms of expectation. People begin to develop a sense of what is likely to happen, even if they cannot always prevent it. At the same time, there is a growing awareness of how long certain problems persist. A tooth that becomes painful may not resolve quickly. It may remain a source of discomfort for weeks, months, sometimes longer. This duration shapes how people respond. It encourages them to look for ways to manage ongoing conditions, rather than expecting quick relief. This shift toward managing duration, rather than seeking immediate resolution, is another subtle but important change. It reflects a deeper engagement with the realities of the body, an understanding that some conditions must be lived with, not simply eliminated. And within this context, the idea of relief itself begins to take on more nuanced meaning. Relief is not always the complete removal of pain. It may be a reduction, a softening, a temporary easing that allows daily life to continue with less strain, a rinse that soothes the gums, a herbal preparation that dulls the edge of discomfort, a method of chewing that avoids a particularly sensitive area. These forms of relief, while modest, are deeply valued. They make the difference between constant distress and manageable discomfort. And because they are achievable within the constraints of the time, they become central to how people navigate dental health. Meanwhile, the physical environment continues to shape the experience in ways that are not always immediately visible. Seasonal changes, for example, can influence not only diet, but the condition of the body as a whole. Cold weather may make pain feel sharper, more persistent. Reduced access to fresh foods may weaken the body's resilience. Periods of dampness may affect living conditions, contributing to general discomfort that amplifies other issues. These environmental factors do not act alone. They interact with existing conditions, sometimes intensifying them, sometimes altering their course. A tooth that is tolerable in one season may become unbearable in another. A minor irritation may develop into something more serious under the pressure of changing conditions. This variability reinforces the sense that dental health is not fixed. It is responsive, shifting with circumstances, influenced by forces that extend beyond the individual. And yet, within this shifting landscape, there are moments of relative stability, periods when the mouth feels manageable, when discomfort recedes into the background, when daily life proceeds without constant interruption. These moments are important not only because they provide relief, but because they shape expectations. They create a sense that improvement is possible, even if temporary. This sense of possibility, however fragile, encourages continued effort. It supports the gradual development of habits, the willingness to try different approaches, the patience to endure while seeking small improvements. At the same time, the social fabric of medieval life continues to play a role in how dental health is experienced and understood. In close-knit communities where people live and work alongside one another, the condition of the body is rarely entirely private. Changes are noticed. Patterns are recognized. Advice is shared, sometimes openly, sometimes indirectly. This shared awareness can be supportive, providing guidance and empathy, but it can also create subtle pressures. A person who struggles with persistent dental problems may feel the weight of comparison, the awareness of difference, even if it is not explicitly stated. These social dynamics add another layer to the experience, one that goes beyond the physical and enters the realm of perception and identity. If we look further into how these experiences accumulate, we begin to see how they contribute to a broader cultural understanding of the body. The mouth, like other parts of the body, becomes a site where ideas about health, balance, and care are tested and refined over time. Certain practices gain acceptance because they seem to work. Others fade because they do not. Beliefs are reinforced or adjusted based on repeated outcomes. This process is gradual, often inconsistent, but it moves steadily forward. And as it does, it begins to create a more defined space for thinking about the mouth not just as a problem to be solved, but as a part of the body that requires ongoing attention. This space is still limited. It does not yet support comprehensive care, but it is growing, shaped by the accumulation of experience, the refinement of practice, and the slow expansion of knowledge. At the same time, the external forces that have been quietly influencing dental health continue to gain strength. Trade networks expand further, bringing new foods, new materials, new ideas. Urban centers grow, creating more complex environments in which people live and interact. Written knowledge becomes more accessible, even if unevenly. Each of these developments adds to the complexity of the system. They introduce new variables, new possibilities, new challenges. The mouth, once shaped primarily by local conditions, becomes increasingly connected to broader patterns. This connection is not always beneficial. It can introduce new risks, new forms of decay, new kinds of discomfort. But it also creates opportunities for change, for the adoption of new practices, for the spread of new ideas, for the gradual improvement of certain conditions. And within this evolving system, the balance between what can be endured and what can be altered continues to shift. It is not a steady progression. There are setbacks, inconsistencies, variations across regions and social groups. But the overall direction becomes more apparent. There is a growing recognition that the condition of the mouth is not entirely fixed, that it can be influenced, even if imperfectly, through a combination of habit, attention, and intervention. This recognition does not eliminate suffering. It does not remove the limitations of the time, but it changes the way people relate to their own bodies. It introduces a sense of participation, a feeling that one can act, even within constraints. And as that sense of participation takes root, it begins to shape the next phase of the story, one in which the accumulated weight of observation, practice, and changing conditions will start to produce more noticeable differences, setting the stage for developments that will, in time, begin to redefine what it means to care for the mouth in a world that is slowly becoming more interconnected, more observant, and more responsive to the quiet signals of the body. What makes this phase particularly interesting is that the changes are not immediately dramatic in appearance, but they begin to alter the rhythm of everyday experience in ways that are easier to feel than to describe. The mouth, which had long been a place where problems arrived suddenly and were endured for as long as possible, starts to feel slightly more predictable in certain cases. Not safe, not fully manageable, but less entirely governed by surprise. This growing sense of pattern is reinforced by repetition. As more people encounter similar sequences of discomfort, response, and outcome, the collective memory of those sequences becomes stronger. A tooth that begins with sensitivity, progresses to pain, then either stabilizes or worsens. This pattern becomes familiar. And familiarity allows for earlier recognition. Earlier recognition, in turn, creates a narrow window in which small actions can be taken before the problem deepens. These actions are still limited in scope, but they are no longer entirely reactive. They exist in a space between awareness and intervention, where timing begins to matter more than it once did. At the same time, the physical materials used in daily life continue to influence how the mouth is treated. The availability of certain herbs, for example, shapes the kinds of remedies people use. Some plants are known to soothe inflammation, others to freshen breath, others to provide a mild, numbing effect. These properties are discovered not through controlled experimentation, but through repeated use and shared experience. Over time, certain combinations of ingredients become more common. Mixtures are prepared, applied, adjusted. Their effects are observed, remembered, and passed on. These practices do not eliminate the underlying causes of dental problems, but they contribute to a growing repertoire of responses, tools that can be used to manage symptoms with greater consistency. There is also a gradual refinement in how these remedies are applied. A substance that is effective when used in a certain way may be less effective when used differently. Through trial and error, people begin to recognize these distinctions. Application becomes more deliberate, more attentive to detail. This attention to detail, though subtle, marks another step toward a more intentional approach to care. Meanwhile, the broader economic landscape continues to evolve, bringing with it changes that are both visible and hidden. Markets become more regular in some regions. Goods circulate with greater frequency. The distinction between local and imported items becomes more pronounced. Within this environment, certain foods begin to carry different meanings. Some are associated with everyday sustenance, others with occasional indulgence. These distinctions influence how and when they are consumed, which in turn affects their impact on the mouth. For example, a sweetened food that is eaten infrequently may have a different effect than one that is consumed regularly, even in small amounts. The pattern of exposure begins to matter as much as the substance itself. This idea that frequency and timing influence outcome is not yet fully articulated, but it is increasingly felt. People notice that certain habits seem to correlate with discomfort, even if they cannot explain why. These observations contribute to a growing sense that the mouth responds not only to what is consumed, but to how it is consumed. At the same time, the structure of daily life continues to shape these patterns. In households where meals are shared and routines are relatively stable, habits can form more easily. In more fragmented or irregular settings, patterns may be harder to establish. This variability creates differences in experience that are not solely based on wealth or location, but also on the organization of daily life itself. And within these differences, the role of personal choice begins to emerge more clearly. Not as a complete freedom, but as a series of small decisions: what to eat when possible, how to respond to discomfort, whether to seek help or wait. These decisions, repeated over time, contribute to the overall condition of the mouth. They do not determine it entirely, but they influence its trajectory in ways that become more apparent as patterns are recognized. At the same time, the process of aging continues to interact with all of these factors, creating a layered experience in which past habits, present conditions, and future expectations are constantly intertwined. An older individual, for instance, may carry the cumulative effects of years of diet, work, and adaptation. Their mouth reflects not only current conditions, but the history of those conditions over time. Younger individuals, observing this, may begin to interpret their own experiences differently, seeing them as part of a longer sequence rather than isolated events. This temporal awareness adds depth to the understanding of dental health. It encourages a perspective that looks beyond the immediate moment, even if the ability to act on that perspective remains limited. And as this awareness spreads, it begins to influence how people think about prevention, even if the term itself is not used. The idea that certain outcomes might be delayed, softened, or partially avoided through consistent attention becomes more plausible. This plausibility does not lead to uniform practice, but it creates a space in which new habits can take root. At the same time, the intellectual environment continues to shift in ways that support these developments. The growing emphasis on observation and comparison, still in its early stages, encourages a more careful approach to describing the body. Differences are noted, patterns are recorded, and over time, these records contribute to a more detailed understanding of how the body behaves. This approach does not immediately translate into effective treatment, but it lays the groundwork for future advances. It creates a framework in which knowledge can accumulate more systematically, even if slowly. And within that framework, the mouth becomes one of many sites where this accumulation takes place. If we step back and look at the broader picture, we can begin to see how these various strands, practical habit, social influence, environmental change, and intellectual development, are beginning to converge. Each strand on its own might not produce significant change, but together, they create a momentum that gradually shifts the experience of dental health away from pure endurance and toward a more engaged, more responsive approach. This shift is not complete. It does not eliminate suffering or uncertainty, but it alters the context in which those experiences occur. And as that context continues to evolve, it prepares the ground for further developments that will build on these early changes, expanding the possibilities for understanding and managing the condition of the mouth. For now, however, the story remains one of gradual transition, of small adjustments accumulating over time, of a world in which the mouth is beginning to be seen not only as a source of pain, but as a part of the body that can, in limited but meaningful ways, be attended to with increasing care, carrying us forward into the next stage of this unfolding transformation. What makes that unfolding transformation so compelling, in the end, is not that medieval people suddenly discovered how to care for their teeth in a way that resembles modern dentistry. They did not. What changed, slowly and unevenly, was something quieter, but in many ways more important. Over the course of centuries, the experience of the mouth shifted from something almost entirely endured to something, however imperfectly, observed, then managed, and eventually, in certain contexts, anticipated. At the beginning of this story, a bad tooth was simply a fact of life. It emerged from daily conditions, coarse bread, hidden grit, limited tools, and a body under constant strain. Pain was recognized, certainly, but it was often accepted as something that would run its course, with little expectation that it could be meaningfully altered. By the later stages, that acceptance had not disappeared, but it had been reshaped. People had begun to notice patterns. They had begun to connect habits with outcomes, even if only loosely. They had begun to act earlier, to experiment more deliberately, to share observations with greater clarity. Practitioners had gained experience. Tools had improved, even if only slightly. Diets had diversified, sometimes helping, sometimes complicating matters. And perhaps most importantly, the idea had taken root, quietly, without proclamation, that the condition of the mouth was not entirely beyond influence. That idea did not remove suffering. Medieval teeth still went bad. Pain still lingered. Teeth were still lost. Infection still threatened. The limits of the time remained very real. But the relationship between people and their own bodies had begun to change. The mouth was no longer only something that failed. It was something that could be watched, something that could be responded to earlier, something that, in small ways, could be shaped through habit and attention. And in that shift, from endurance to awareness, from awareness to cautious action, we can see the early foundations of something much larger. Not modern dentistry itself, not yet, but the mindset that would eventually make it possible. Because every later development, every instrument, every treatment, every preventative practice would depend, First, on that simple but powerful recognition that what happens in the mouth is not random, that it follows patterns, and that those patterns, however slowly, can be understood. If you've been listening closely, you might notice that this story isn't really about teeth alone. It's about how people learn to live with the limits of their world, and then gradually begin to move those limits. So before we close, I'm curious, what part of this felt most surprising to you? Was it the role of bread and hidden grit, the slow introduction of sugar, or the idea that awareness itself was the first real step toward change? And if you'd like to keep exploring this kind of quiet, deeply human history, you're always welcome to join me again. There are many more stories like this, waiting just beneath the surface.